This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachik discourse. This entire podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. All of these episodes draw on the rich sources and discussions of women and mitzvot on Deracheha.org. This episode delves into the ways in which we imbue our Shabbatot with holiness, and the way this holiness is reflected through the act of making Kiddush over wine. We also talk about women's obligation in both nighttime and daytime Kiddush, and some practical halachot that frequently come up.
Hi, Yosefa.
Hi, Shana.
We're here today to discuss the mitzvah of Kiddush, which is one of those mitzvot that many Jews, even those who are not fully observant, are aware of, especially in Israel. We know that in many traditional homes, there are families that gather for some kind of Friday night dinner, and they'll often start by making Kiddush. And in Israel, these Shabbat dinners, even amongst a good number of chilonim, totally secular Israelis, are quite popular. And I was recently reading this really fabulous book called The Genius of Israel, which was put out by Dan Siner, who now is, I think, a name that a lot of people are familiar with because of the popular podcast that he hosts, Call Me Back. So he put out a book, Startup Nation, that people are aware of. And then right before the war broke out in the summer of 2023, there was another book that was put out with his brother-in-law, Saul Singer. And in that book, The Genius of Israel, they're discussing what makes Israel unique. What about the society makes it different than other countries? And there's a whole chapter in that book about Shabbat. They call it Thanksgiving every week. And in that chapter, they quote Micha Goodman, who's one of Israel's leading intellectuals, who discusses what does it mean for a society when over half of its members make Kiddush. And he talks about the fact that ritual is one of the most powerful parts of culture because it is something that really glues people together. He says there that it's at the root of why more than 70% of Jewish Israelis have a traditional Friday night dinner with family and friends, which I thought was fascinating. 70% is a huge number.
First of all, I have to read that book, Shana.
Yeah.
I haven't read it.
It's great.
I listened to him also, but I haven't read that one. And I think he does a great job of sort of being very positive and optimistic about Israel and also being realistic. I think that's part of what's unique about his voice in the scene at the moment. I think I'll just add that another really big element of this is the disconnect from media, meaning anything that sort of gets us as a culture and as a people all over the world, not just Jews, right? At this current moment, to sort of disconnect from media, to come inward, to join, to gather, and to hopefully be focused on what we're doing. I think as time progresses in the age we're living in, has even more of a pull and more of a significance in the lives that we're leading.
Absolutely.
We know that people around the world are adopting a tech Shabbat, right, where they're sort of self-inducing themselves with the day without technology. I'm happy that I don't actually have to make that choice. That for me, it's something that I do. It's part of the definition of my life. But I think that ideally, I would be happy to have more of these tech Shabbatot throughout the week as well. Sometimes I try, to the chagrin of the people around me and my colleagues.
An hour.
Sometimes to not respond. But it also reminds me of this idea that I discovered a long time ago in one of our Hirsch's somewhat like lesser known books. It's a known book. It's Choriv. It's where he really describes a lot of reasons behind different mitzvot. He chooses which ones. But he wrote something there about Shabbat where he says that, once a week we kind of like lift our hands up and stop keeping the world going, and it reminds us that we're not actually the ones that are in charge. And something about that I felt was very, very powerful. Maybe because I am like a doer, but I also deeply enjoy the feeling of being like totally abstaining from that kind of doing anything and being creative in the world. But I think that it's a really important idea in the modern world where we have a very strong sense of our power and of what we can create. Whether that's good or bad, it's a different question. But this idea of sort of taking a step back and remembering that we are not the creators, but God is, and the world is still going to work even if we don't do something today, I think is also an idea that's sort of can gain even more popularity and resonance in our lives today.
Mm-hmm. I really personally am so grateful for all the ideas that you just mentioned, especially just like the break from the technology and the ability to have the opportunity to connect to family and friends. But it's interesting that, I'm sure that's what is pulling a lot of Jews around the world and Israelis to really stop and to have that traditional dinner. But I don't think that Shabbat is only about the social piece and the connection to people around us, because I've been noticing lately that so many of the Chatufim, so many of the returning hostages from Gaza, have been describing how they made a concerted effort to make Kiddush in captivity every week, even though many of them were alone or they were with
Mhm.
another person. And long before, for example, long before Omer Shem Tov came back, he was released only after 505 days in captivity. Itai Regev, who was with him and came back in the first hostage deal, which was in that November, of 2023, not so long after the war started. One of the first things that he did was tell Omer's parents that Omer was observing Shabbat in captivity and that he was making an effort to make Kiddush every week. And he said that somehow they even convinced the terrorists to bring them a bottle of grape juice, and that they saved that bottle for Kiddush, and they made sure to keep track of the days of the week. And then when Omer himself came out, he shared that that bottle lasted half a year, and we made Kiddush on it dozens of times. And he said that the grape juice never spoiled, the bottle never emptied, and it was my personal version, he said, of the miracle of the oil flask that we discussed, around Hanukkah time, that just this feeling of a mitzvah that you're holding on to. And other hostages also. Elia Cohen sent a message to his mother that he was making Kiddush every Shabbat and saying brachot every morning. Eli Sharabi wrote about this in his book Chatuf, in his book Hostage, that he made sure to say Kiddush every Friday night. And he describes in that book, and spoken about the book before because it was so powerful, how the cup was filled with salty water, like disgusting salty water. But he describes how in those sacred moments, the salty drops transformed into something sweeter than the finest wine. And that saying the words of the Kiddush would give him faith. And they would also connect him in this very strong way to his mother and to his memories of saying Kiddush in his home. And as I was reading these and thinking about these, and discussing them, I was also talking about them with Laurie Novick, who's the founder of Deracheha, and she told me that it was reminding her of a piece from Elie Wiesel, who I didn't read this book. It's called The Sermon of Hell's Gate. And in there, he quotes a fellow inmate, which as she was telling me this, I'm like, I think I heard this at some point, someone quote this, but there was a fellow inmate of his in the concentration camp, Shimon Suker, who said he announced to all of the inmates with him that soon we have to recite the Kiddush, but we have nothing over which to say the blessing. Not even a morsel of bread remains from today's meal. Let us lift our soup bowls to our eyes and fill them with our tears. Over these tears, we will say Kiddush for the Almighty, which is so crazy. Like so moving and so crazy. Like what's driving people in these really difficult circumstances to want to make Kiddush? And what I come back to is something that I've read in several different books from Echad Ha'am, the Zionist thinker and writer, who said more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people, meaning that there's something about tapping into that experience of Shabbat, which is just this really crucial force for Jews in preserving a sense of unity or a sense of something greater, a sense of community, a sense of something spiritual, a connection to God. And we know there's so many aspects of this. It's certainly a unifying force for Jews across different lands and cultures. It definitely gives us that shared experience, when people travel around the world and they come to Chabad and you walk in and everybody's there from a different country, but you sit down at a Shabbat table and someone gets up and makes Kiddush. It's like this instant connection that all of a sudden people feel to each other. And that's the social element that you spoke about earlier, but I think it's actually grounded in something that's much, much bigger and deeper than that.
No, for sure. I think it's grounded in something deeper, and we're going to try and unpack that in the conversation. But I also think that that image of the Chabad house, and it's sort of like it's like the calling for everybody, and everyone kind of like it rings familiar. So I think it goes back to a phrase we used in a much earlier episode about common language, that these are rituals, whether it's
Mm.
their halachik specifically or something else, that it's kind of a common language for us, like throughout the world. And so wherever people are and whatever kind of Judaism they're kind of practicing, something like Kiddush seems
Yeah.
to sort of sail above all of those different shifts. And I think that that is a particular power of Kiddush. I think another element of Kiddush that might be powerful and that might be bringing people in who aren't even necessarily halachically observant by definition, by their own definition, I think is another interesting piece. It isn't specific to Kiddush, but is specific to all sort of voluntary, I would say, ritual acts of bringing Shabbat into your life. And it sounds funny, but when it comes to Shabbat, mitzvot aseh, right? Or, whether it's making kiddush or blessing the
The
bread or
positive
lighting
mitzvot.
candles, the positive mitzvot that we do are ones that have more popularity with the broader Jewish world. And I think it's because there's a very clear sense that it creates something special. It creates a certain atmosphere, and it's a ritual. It's something that family can gather around. And I think that that's a really important tool. The parts that I would say are obviously less popular are the lo ta'aseh, okay, is the shamor that we'll talk about soon.
The
Is the
prohibitions.
prohibitions, the things we refrain from doing. I think that there's also something, less fun, right? Meaning it's less joyful in that sense, doesn't create that same sense of joy. But another piece about it is also because when we refrain from something, for some reason as humans, I think it reminds us of how it creates those differences between us. It's what makes, well, that family does that thing, or that family does that thing. When often, by the way, it's what that family doesn't do or that family doesn't do. Meaning it's sometimes the act of what we refrain from ends up being a bigger defining feature than the things that we do. And I don't exactly know how to explain that, but it feels that there's a truth to that in my heart when I observe these phenomenon. And so it's going to be less popular for people to refrain from doing something over a span of time. It's also kind of the kind of thing you kind of speak about less. There's less
also
what
harder.
it's harder, and there's less what to gather around in the things you don't do. There's something to gather around in the things that you are positively doing. And I'm not saying that to take away from any of these phenomena. I'm just observing it as I'm seeing it around me.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting what you're saying because it's counterintuitive. Because usually as humans, it's easier to not do something,
Yeah.
right? Because that's something that's passive. So
Right.
you're just abstaining from something. It's not asking much of you. Whereas when we want people to do something proactive that requires effort, oftentimes that's harder. But I think you're absolutely right that when it comes to Shabbat, it's the reverse because abstaining here means stopping to do all the regular routine things that are part of our life. And it's really hard to separate from those things, especially when you're like, okay, God rested, but like turning on the TV or using my phone, like that's not necessarily right. We sometimes think of rest in a very concrete way, and that's not necessarily what the Torah meant by rest, but the positive things that you're describing, like lighting candles and making kiddush and sitting down for a family meal, that like elevates the day and that brings this different sense of sanctity into the home. And I think that's why it's easier for people to tap into that. But I do want to point out that often in a colloquial sense, when we talk about Shabbat, we talk about being Shomer Shabbat, observing Shabbat. And observing Shabbat, the Shamor part, the Shmirah of Shabbat, is talking about abstaining from the prohibitions. And that's because we know from our experience, and I think people also who try to bring elements of Shabbat also into their lives know that to fully, really experience the beauty that we know of Shabbat, you really do need to abstain from a lot of things. Like if you want to get the full effect. And circling back to Omer Shem Tov, when Itai Regev came back and he spoke to his parents and he said he's making an effort to make Kiddush. So obviously that was very meaningful for them, but Kiddush was something that he grew up with. They actually make Kiddush in their home every week. And then Itai said to him, no, it's not just that he's making Kiddush, he's observing Shabbat. And they said, what does that mean, observing Shabbat in the tunnels? Like there's no TV, there's no phone, there's no whatever. And he said, no, but they gave us each a little tiny flashlight. And Omer, every single Shabbat for 24 hours, refuses to put it on. He sits in absolute darkness. And I think that also just shows us like there's something, again, bigger going on here. It's not only about the positive. It's about wanting to bring some kind of deeper connection to God and to the creation story into our lives.
It's very powerful. You've gone into a lot more of the details of a lot of the returnees. No, I appreciate you bringing it to me. I think for self-preservation, a lot of it, I didn't go into it, so I appreciate it.
Just because you're mentioning that, I find myself really listening to the interviews with the hostages and reading their stories. And I think part of it is because they went through something that they themselves say they never would have believed that they could have
Yeah.
survived.
Yeah.
And they found in themselves strength that they didn't think that they had. And I think in a time when we are looking for strength, it's very inspiring to read about people who are basically carrying the message that we're stronger than we think we are, and that and don't despair. Like, we could do this.
Yeah. Thank you, Shane. I appreciate that. I think I wanted to think with you a little bit about the role that Shabbat has in our life, right? It's a role that shifts and is dynamic, right? Let's broaden our conversation for a second away from, let's say, Kiddush specifically, but Shabbat as a whole. I think for many of us, it really, we behave, we interact with it differently at different points in our lives. And, there are times when ideally Shabbat could be like a day of Torah study. I remember that from a stage of my life when that was when I did most of Shabbat.
Long time ago.
A long, long time ago. And there's times where Shabbat is more of like a social time with meals with family and friends or people in the community, or it's a time to reach out dafka to neighbors. And there's times when Shabbat is really more family oriented. I know I've observed this on myself that in the past, I don't know, maybe six months or so, I've like really needed Shabbat to be like a time where I retreat into my shell, and just less company, less action. And for me, I have to pull in my husband. He's like the one who loves to be the social butterfly and invite. And I'm like, just such a crazy semester and so many things going on. And for me, Shabbat has been this time to like just literally sit in one place, connect with the people, my family and my husband, and just like not be engaged in the outside world.
And
it's so interesting.
recharge. You're really describing like a
Really
recharge
need
process.
it. I literally, I feel it desperately when like I have a Shabbat where I had to work or whatever it was. And it's really, and so, but there's different stages. You know what I'm saying? That's not always what Shabbat needs to be. And it's just interesting that I look at Shabbat sometimes as like a barometer of where I'm holding in terms of my like internal energies. And I guess one thing I just would want to say is that I think it's worth thinking about how much we are bringing our avodat Hashem into our Shabbat. Meaning, how are we looking at it? How are we using it as a tool for avodat Hashem? I think that it is a break from productive activity, or what we call melacha. But we kind of often need to make room for the way that kind of avodat Hashem is going to feature in Shabbat, because if we don't actively put it there, a lot of times other things can kind of fill it. And so the tools that are sort of the common, religious tools of Shabbat are tefillot and our singing and our meals, that the conversation can be more elevated, right? And being careful that it doesn't slip into like, other kinds of conversation or gossip or things like that. But I also think it's worth thinking about, because we really are trying to find activities that raise our spirit. And while a lot of times Shabbat can be consumed with like board games or maybe reading literature that isn't necessarily so Shabbat oriented kind of literature, and or like just staying in pajamas all day long, and maybe shul is or isn't part of the process. I think that it's just worth thinking about that, because ultimately, yes, Shabbat is a day of rest, but it's a day of rest in order to create space for something higher. And I think that a lot of times, just through the habits of life, that can kind of get lost in the shuffle. And I think that it's worth thinking about how Shabbat can be elevated in the way that we're observing it and what we bring into that day.
Absolutely, which is not always simple, and especially at different stages of life. And if you have children, how to bring them into that and how to make sure that it's meaningful and, I think, a significant day for everyone. For me, what's important, because I do relate to the experience that you're describing as Shabbat being dynamic, or us experiencing it differently at different stages of life. But for me, what's important for myself and for my children is that it's not just a vacation day, that it's not just a day off from school and from work, but it's a day where we somewhat feel and experience holiness, whether it's at shul or whether it's in our home, whether it's through the conversations that we have. And we often refer to Shabbat as Shabbat Kodesh, or where you and I grew up, Shabbos Kodesh, even lots of songs around that word that people love to sing. And the reason that we refer to it as Shabbat Kodesh is because the word Kedusha is a word that often appears alongside Shabbat when the Torah is describing it. So we know that the mitzvah of Shabbat appears numerous times throughout the Torah, and two of those times that really stand out are in the fourth commandment of the Aseret HaDibrot. In the 10 Commandments, we have two 2 recordings of them. And each time the commandment of Shabbat appears in a distinct way, but each time with the word with a word that has to do with Kedusha and sanctity. So in Shemot, we are commanded Zachor at Yom HaShabbat, the Kadsho, that we need to remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it, which is identified with performing the positive commandments that you described earlier. And in Tvarim, we are commanded Shamor at Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, keep Shabbat in order to sanctify it. And that's identified with observing the prohibitions. And the Gemara teaches us that Hashem uttered these 2 words, Zachor and Shamor, simultaneously, which we say in the Chadodi. A lot of people know it from there, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. And that what we mean when we say Zachor, remembering it, is not simply mentally not forgetting the way that we think of remembering, but actually requires a more concrete act, which they say is the verbal proclamation about Shabbat, which is our mitzvah of Kiddush. What's interesting is that the pasuk says, Zachor at Yom HaShabbat l'Kadsho, meaning that we need to remember. It's commanding us to remember Shabbat and to sanctify it. But then in our actual Kiddush, when we finish the bracha, we say, Baruch atah Hashem, Mekadesh HaShabbat. Blessed are you, God, who sanctifies the Shabbat, because God has already invested Shabbat with sanctity, beginning with the fact that He rested after a week of creation. So when we make Kiddush, we're either coming as humans to recognize the God-given sanctity that this day already has, which is how the Rambam thinks of it, or the Ramban believes that when we make Kiddush, what we're doing is adding to and actively investing Shabbat with this extra Kedusha, which is amazing because it means that Kiddush is like this meeting point between Hashem's Kedusha that He gave to Shabbat and us as humans, adding to Kedusha on our own. And I think that that's a really important concept that also we discuss on the Deracheha website, that how Shabbat is like this awesome day because it's this mix of what God brings to it and then what we as humans do with it. It's not just that on Shabbat we're mekabel the Shabbat, that we accept Shabbat and we welcome it into our lives and we embrace it. We're also mekadesh Shabbat. We ourselves also do things to sanctify it. And one of those main things that we do is begin the day by saying Kiddush and by actually proclaiming, these words of Kedusha over Shabbat.
So, Shana, I just wanted to pull back a layer on that for a minute because we use the word Kedusha, but I think we often don't know what it means. Meaning we translate it as holiness.
What is
but
that?
The word is kind of holy, meaning it has a hole. I don't think many of us know, like it sort of is this thing that we say, but we don't really know what it is. And a treatise on all the different views of Kedusha throughout the centuries would be a whole episode. But I just wanted to bring a few ideas that I think are helpful. And I think that they're helpful also to think about what is Shabbat coming to do. Kiddush as sort of an emblem or the entryway of Shabbat. But there have been all different approaches to what this means and why Shabbat is bichlal a representation of something that is kadosh in the world. So I just wanted to start maybe even with the first one that we often think about of when we the refrain in Kiddushim to you in Parshat Kiddushim, you should be kadosh. So the commentary that often gets taught in, let's say, in a school system is the Midrash refracted through Rashi, which is prushim to you, that you should be separated. And that goes to this idea of the prohibitions, of the things we don't do, right? But that's one view. But the idea being that when you don't do something, you allow something holier to come in its place. But it kind of, by definition, has a slightly more negative perspective.
Meaning like you create a void that then is filled with Kedusha.
Yeah, exactly. You create a void. But there, I would say that oftentimes people can a little bit get lost between the tool itself and what you're trying to bring in. Like often people sort of focus on what they're not doing, but then they don't necessarily go the next step to think about what am I bringing in,
right?
Okay, which is more like the ruach and meeting the spirit of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a next stage level. Other societies sometimes get lost in the stepping back and then just go straight for the ruach. So it depends where they are. But another piece that also is, I think for me is very meaningful. I'm going to say it in the name of Rav Kook, but it's really just refracting Kabbalistic thinking throughout the centuries. It's not just Rav Kook. It's all of much of Kabbalistic thinking and Lurianic Kabbalah. But the idea that holiness, meaning God's presence, is everywhere. And what we need to do is in everything we do, try and connect to the presence of God that permeates the whole world. It kind of goes back to this initial philosophical question of if God is everywhere, how are we even able to exist here? Oh, it must be that God actually condenses himself. He's mitzamtzim in all different elements of the world. And so our job is to kind of figure out, to touch where God is throughout the world. And so we do these acts like keeping Shabbat or making Kiddush. We're engaged in mitzvot, that every time we do mitzvot, we're like touching God's presence in the world. Okay, that's like another very pervasive view of what Kedusha means.
Nice.
I don't think that becomes concrete for anybody hearing that, but I think it gives it a frame of how to think about it. But what you said before actually really connects to, and again, many have said it, but I'll just say that if anyone wants to read a beautiful treatise on what the word Kedusha means or the different phrases, Rabbi Sachs' introduction to the book of Vayikra, in my mind, is his best introduction in all of his.
Because Vayikra is an entire sefer about Kedusha.
Exactly. And he in his introduction, he has a treatise on basically what is Kedusha, and it's really beautiful. So that's a great place to read this idea. But you can say it through all different voices throughout history have said these ideas, which is essentially, if you think about where we use the word Kedusha, so it comes up in a place, meaning the Mikdash or the Mishkan, that is Kadosh, and we use it about elements of time, right? In our case, about Shabbat, but you also have it about the Chagim, right? We use Kedusha describing those two different realms of life. And the idea kind of goes like this.
Meaning space and time.
Exactly. Rav Soloveitchik writes about this also in some seminal essays of his, of this Kedusha and spaces of time. But essentially what that means is that in order that God won't take over the world, right, and we can exist here even and function with divinity around us, that God sort of attributes importance to a particular space and particular times. And those spaces and times, we can connect to God through them. But what does that mean, to connect to God through them? And then pitom we have revelation? No. But it's exactly the fact that we're opening up that space, right? Whether it's Shabbat every week or it's a Mikdash, he says very poignantly, the Mikdash is pretty empty. It's kind of like a frame. And there's some kelim inside, but it's just you going into that space. The idea being that when we leave open space, that's also a place of elevation and not like kind of distilled by other mundane kind of activities. That's where we can meet God, in that space. And so we have these, again, a mikdash or a mishkan, and also these holidays or every week Shabbat, where we abstain from doing something so that there could be open space that something else can enter. And
Beautiful.
I love this idea. Also, I think that many people, they intuit this, even if they never framed it like this. Because why, right? How many times that we were working on something, and we were trying to fill ourselves or reading, and we just kind of got overwhelmed. And then like you go on a walk or you take a shower, right? And all of a sudden, the like ideas kind of start pouring in, or you have like a moment of clarity. A lot of times, in order for something deeper to overtake us, we actually need to gain space from something. Or someone can, go on a walk outside, or they go on a hike, and dafka the emptiness, air quotes, of that space, you can sense in that space something much deeper. Some of us, I think, intuit that more in the world or less. I'm a person who needs a lot of space. So this for me is really key.
No, but it taps into what you were saying earlier about Shabbat, that we need to stop sometimes.
Yeah,
Even if
exactly.
it's the tech Shabbat, you need some space just to like process what happened to you this last week and where you are.
And it's not so that we do nothing. And that's not to fill it with other things, but it's so that something else can come into that space. And that's the gift of Kedusha, meaning that we can touch something else, dafka, by taking a step back in other realms of our life. And
Just
again,
being.
Yeah, just being, but the being brings us closer to God. And that's a Kedusha according to that sort of line of thinking.
Beautiful. I think also the fact that we make Kiddush over wine specifically also connects into different ideas of holiness that we read about in our sources, because there's a very core underlying idea that's brought down in different sources, that what it means for us as human beings to be kadosh is not to abstain from anything pleasurable and good. There is sometimes this Christian idea out there in the world that to be truly holy, we have to rise above our physical selves and therefore, abstain from anything that has to do with the sexual drive, or abstain from, eating good food, or because these things are like this worldly, and people who are truly holy and want to connect to something ephemeral, to God, to something beyond this world, need to, as much as possible, separate from physical physical entities. And actually, Judaism doesn't believe that. Judaism believes that Kedusha is created from very much partaking in a physical world, but then elevating it and using it in positive ways, because a lot of the physical forces that we have in this world are neutral and they could be used in all different kind of directions. So when we come and we make this proclamation at the beginning of Shabbat, where we talk about Kedusha, it's very significant that we do it over wine, because in essence, what we're saying is that wine and alcohol is a very powerful substance. It could be used in destructive or harmful ways. It could cause damage to relationships. It could badly affect our judgment. It could be used by people who degrade or disgrace themselves. But Judaism comes and says, no, take this drink, take this substance, and show that you could use it to bring Kedusha into the world. You could use it to elevate this meal. You could use it to connect to God. You could use it to allow yourselves to be more joyful and more relaxed, and to add something unique to the Shabbat experience. We don't always take out a bottle of wine in the middle of the week, and sit down and enjoy it. So when we make Kiddush on Shabbat, as well as do other mitzvot over wine, such as getting married, we're demonstrating that we are empowered as humans to use wine in good taste, to drink it in moderation, and to use it only in ways that will increase the holiness, which of course is not a simple thing. Unfortunately, we know that in our world today, and specifically even in the world of people who are Shomer Torah and Mitzvot, there's been a lot of talk. Always, I feel like, over the last many decades, but especially recently, I've seen magazine articles and podcasts talking about the excess use of alcohol in our communities, and these phenomenons of, like, not just Kiddush clubs, but now there's this Tohameh idea of before Shabbat having a taste of Shabbat and having a little bit of potato kogon, a little bit of cholent, and it often involves a lot, not a little bit, a lot of alcohol, and people going into Shabbat drunk or not really able to tap into the Kiddush, elements of Shabbat. And I think that, going back to how you started the conversation about Kedusha, when we say Kiddushim Tihiyu, and we encounter that parsha in the middle of Sefer Vayikra, so you quoted Rashi about being separate and, being Prushim, but the Ramban there is also a pretty often quoted Ramban, because he says, what does it mean to be kadosh? Don't be a naval bereshut ha-Torah. Don't be, the literal translation is, a scoundrel with the permission of the Torah. Or basically, don't be someone who behaves disgracefully while, like, checking off, all the halachik boxes. Meaning, like, what? It doesn't say anywhere that we can't drink alcohol. This isn't something that's prohibited. But where's the spirit of the law here? Or where is the drinking in a positive way that is, in good taste and with moderation? And I think the fact that we come and we start Shabbat and we say we're going to make Kiddush and we're going to make it on wine is us also reminding ourselves how we're supposed to use wine in the context of Kedusha.
I just want to say that every time the phrase of Naval Bereshit Torah comes up, of that, sort of checking off the boxes, but all the empty space, I'll just do whatever I want with it kind of thing, it brings me back to, I think for me, it's one of my core values as an observant Jew, which is this idea of, what am I bringing to the table? Meaning, I'm not here to check off boxes. Halacha provides a frame. In theory, it's a very filling frame. There's a lot we're supposed to do, right? But in reality, it's a frame of our life. But the question becomes, how do we then actually behave with that frame? And to me, like, the quality of a person's religious life and spiritual self is defined by those things. It's almost sometimes more defined by those things than it is by, did I check off
Goes
or
back
not
to the
check off.
spaces you were talking about
Exactly.
earlier.
What are you bringing into that space? I'm also thinking about it because I just finished a unit on this in Migdal Oz, and every time I do it, the students are kind of like a little bit shaken, because it's like I really am challenging them to ask this question of, like, how are you filling in those spaces? You have free time. What are you doing in that free time? And it's
right. It's not like, oh, I spent 10 hours learning Torah today, so now I could blow the next 5, because I was like Yote, I checked off that box of learning Torah. Our religious lives are defined by the conscious, intentional decisions that we make, even when there's not something specific that we need to do. So yeah, that's a very powerful idea. I think also when we get into the actual text of the Friday night Kiddush, it also goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of these different aspects of Kedusha, the God-given Kedusha and the Kedusha that we sanctify Shabbat with, because Rav Soloveitchik highlights that when we make Kiddush at night, we talk about two things. We talk about, at the beginning of Kiddush, the story of creation, and we call Shabbat a zikaron l'maaseh breshit, a way to remember creation and remember our Creator in essence, that He created the world in 6 days and then He purposely rested. And that's the God-given inherent aspect of Kiddusha, of sanctity, that's found in the Shabbat. But then the second half of Kiddush talks about Shabbat as a zecher l'yetziat Mitzrayim, as a way to remember the Exodus. And when we talk about a way to remember the Exodus, so not only is that referring to the fact that not only did God create the world and then like leave it be, but He continues to be an active, very engaged player in the world. But it also is reminding us that what happened when we left Mitzrayim, what happened when we left Egypt, we were given the very first mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, of sanctifying the new month. And when we sanctify the new month, what we do as people is show that we as people are going to sanctify the new moon and we are going to declare the new month. And then that allows us to then sanctify the holy days of that month if there are chagim there. And Shabbat is also related to that because it's basically a similar kind of thing. We just do it every week. So I think that when we read the text of Kiddush on Friday night, it's also showing us that, again, like it's not only that Shabbat is holy because Hashem gave it to us, it's also dependent on what we do with that day. And I think this is one of the reasons that one of the very first mitzvot that we got after we left Mitzrayim, before we even got to Har Sinai, when we stopped in Marah, was the mitzvah of Shabbat, because it's such a essential and crucial defining part of who we are as a people. Everything that we've discussed right now is completely universally relevant, both to men and to women. But because this is a podcast of women talking mitzvot, let's talk now a little bit specifically about women's obligation in Kiddush and their relationship to this mitzvah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that we definitely need to start from this point, which we're going to come back to often when it comes to women and mitzvot, which is that this is a positive time-bound commandment. It's a mitzvah to asay shezman krama. It has a very specific time to it. And in theory, we have this kind of rule in the back of our mind always that women are exempt from these kind of mitzvot. But in the case of Kiddush, we are not exempt from it. We are completely obligated. And that's because of this connection you mentioned earlier of Shamor and Zachor, because we are obligated in both the prohibitions of the Shamor, what we don't do, and the Zachor of the positive commandments. And so because of that, we're obligated in Kiddush, and this is considered to be a full Torah level obligation. This obligation of Shamor and Zachor overrides the fact that it's time bound. It sort of makes it's a more important piece in terms of the halachic character of the mitzvah. That's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins, and there's a total consensus on that Kiddush and also nighttime Kiddush specifically. Why is that different? Because daytime Kiddush is actually called Kiddusha Rabbah. It's called Kiddusha Rabbah as a nickname because it's actually the smaller. It sounds the great Kiddush, but it's because it's actually considered to be a lower level Kiddush. And what that means is that it's a rabbinic obligation, and it's kind of like a reminder of the Torah level obligation that we do at night. But we say Kiddush in the day in order to begin the daytime meal with honor and to begin with praise, right? And to begin the meal with a bracha over wine, which really blesses Hashem for Shabbat. And so we are obligated as well. Women are obligated fully in the daytime Kiddush as well, in the same level obligation just as men are. And I also say something that might be surprising, but women can also discharge men of their Kiddush obligation, i.e. to be motzi men.
Because we have the same obligation.
We have the same obligation. And so the debate that comes up regarding women reciting Kiddush for others is, let's say, if it's in a bigger group that's beyond her family or in some sort of public setting. But I will just say that the question of women being motzi others, or the general halachic question of who can discharge the obligation of another person, is a very complex topic. There's a lot of elements to it. So first of all, anybody who wants to look, there's a specific article about discharging obligations on the Deracheha website. But I will just say, in this case of Kiddush, it's not a complicated topic because we have here within the family setting, because everybody has the same level obligation.
Exactly. And I think it is so important that we are going over these halachot and we're discussing this together on this podcast about women's mitzvot, because candle lighting is like an obvious women's mitzvah.
Yeah.
But Kiddush is one of those mitzvot that people automatically associate with men. Now, it could be because many people grew up in homes where their fathers made Kiddush, or they went to shul and the rabbi made Kiddush. So in our heads, it's associated with like a male mitzvah. And also a lot of times in Gan, in nursery, when we have the Shabbat party, the Shabbos party on Friday afternoon. So there's the Ima Shel Shabbat, the Shabbos Ima, and there's the Ava Shel Shabbat, the Shabbos Abba. And of course, the Ima Shel Shabbat lights the candles. And of course, the Ava Shel Shabbat has to bring the grape juice for the Gan, and he makes Kiddush. So it's often a surprise when women learn, or they find out, or they are told that they are just as obligated as men, which means a few things. First of all, women who are eating on their own should, of course, feel absolutely comfortable making Kiddush for themselves. So this could be a group of students in a midrashah. This could be a group of single women who are eating together. This could be new mothers in a maternity ward in a hospital dining room. This could be a single mom eating with her children, or this could be a woman whose husband is in home that Shabbat, or maybe he just hasn't come home from shul yet. Absolutely, pour yourself that cup and make Kiddush. It's not an issue at all. And as you said, the Shulchan Aruch holds that a woman can even discharge a man's obligation. The only place where a discussion comes up and where there's different perspectives is about, should women be making Kiddush for men who aren't part, of her household? But again, on a straightforward halachic sense, in terms of discharging their obligation, that's not the issue. It's more in terms of, does she feel appropriate? Do they feel comfortable? Other issues that are beyond the actual specific issue of being motzi someone and discharging someone's obligation in Kiddush. And here, just on a personal level, I've heard different things from different women. There are some women in these situations who don't flinch. They're like, I am, like
the woman of
Baal.
household.
Exactly. Yeah. I am the Baalat Habayit. This is my house. I make Kiddush all the time on Friday night, on Shabbat, whatever. So yes, thank God I am hosting and I have people over, but I'm not giving up this, thing that I always do. They feel ownership over the mitzvah and they're proud to be able to make it. But there are other women who feel less comfortable because either they feel like imposters or because they find it emotionally difficult, depending on their circumstances, right? Like, we know it's really hard that life doesn't always turn out the way that we want it to. And sometimes when a woman is in a situation where she is the one making Kiddush, it could be painful. It could be painful because it's a reminder of her husband who has passed. It could be painful because it's a reminder of a difficult divorce. It could be painful because she wishes that she was in another situation where there was someone standing next to her where he was making Kiddush. And in all of these situations, each woman will obviously choose how to navigate it in a way that feels right to her. But what's important for me to say is that as a community, we should be aware that A, women are obligated in Kiddush, and B, that on a pure halachic level, there's no issue to make it for a man. So if a man ever finds himself at a meal like this, he doesn't have to feel like, oh no, maybe I wasn't. Exactly, maybe I wasn't, maybe I doesn't yotze. And I think as a community, it behooves us to do everything that we can to empower women and help them feel comfortable in this realm.
I'm laughing as you're saying this because my mother literally, hi mom, if you're listening, my mother just told me this story that my father passed away 9 years ago. And so she's had many years to sort of practice, doing these mitzvot on her own. But she said something changed recently, and she had like a whole bunch of people over this past Shabbat, and she like made Kiddush, and she had always been cutting the challah. I think Kiddush was newish, and she just told me this on the phone a few days ago. She's like, I made Kiddush, and everyone was so impressed. And I said, Kol hakavod, mom, you are ba'alat habayit. This is good. I was thinking about that because I just had this conversation with her.
These are really real life things.
They're very real life, and they are very sensitive. So I also always appreciate that, like, you're able to paint the real picture of all the different situations that people are in.
There's no judgment. Like, not the same thing is right for everyone, and it's important that we just give space so that everyone feels that they could find the solution or the thing that's going to be the most that's going to feel the most right for them.
Totally. And I also just want to bring up one sort of general point and one more specific one, which is that generally, as we said earlier, Kiddushes are said over wine. By the way, I'm also laughing at that because my husband does not drink wine. So we never, ever, ever use wine. We always use grape juice.
I grew up in a house like that. We only ever had grape juice.
So I think we had a combination, but in my house, like it's just it's a non-issue. But it was enacted over wine, or that which is similar to wine. And even though that one person usually recites the Kiddush and is motzi everybody else, and it's enough for them to drink sort of a cheekful of wine, it's also preferable that everybody present also has some of it to drink. Typically, cups are poured out for each person that's there for the Kiddush, or then maybe they pass it around, or there's different ways. Every family does this differently, depending on their like germ sensitivity and things like that. But I will just say that that's the general reality. But this does raise a very particular kind of question when it comes to couples who are in nida, which is the time from woman gets her period until she goes to the mikvah. And during this time of one of the many halachot, as we call them, or the ways that couples sort of are distanced from each other during this time. So one of them is that they're not supposed to pour or serve each other wine or grape juice. Okay. And they're not even supposed to, let's say, pour it and then designate it for the spouse. So that doesn't help. And so what sometimes comes up for couples is that they can feel uncomfortable, that maybe, if they do something that looks unusual, that people who are there, whether it's their children or guests, will know their status. And this question comes up in a whole bunch of ways with couples when they're like concerned about that. And I think there's different ways to approach this question and how people feel about it. Of course, whether someone does or doesn't pour something doesn't mean that the people there know what's going on, later that day in the privacy of a couple's personal space. Like maybe they can get a sense, but I don't think most people are necessarily thinking that way. But sometimes couples can feel uncomfortable, like it's a window into their personal status. And so I will just say that there are many suggestions. And by the way, this is not a conversation about halachot, but in general, when it comes to these halachot, there's a lot of creative ways that a couple can kind of navigate, both that they feel comfortable and also that they could feel that they're not like communicating to the world what's going on. But specifically in the case of the Kiddush wine, so first of all, a husband can make Kiddush. He can drink from it and he can put the cup down, and the wife can then drink it from him.
Right, because she's allowed to have, right,
exactly. And so that's a very, very simple solution. But if she doesn't want to drink from his cup, then he can put the cup down before he drinks, and then she can pour some into her cup first, and then he can drink after. And also, if other people are present, you can also just pass the cup around to other people, and then it can come back to the wife, because once there are other people that are also drinking from it, it's not an issue.
Really, the only thing that they can't do is for him to make Kiddush and pour out wine that's designated for her.
Exactly.
Right? Like even if he pours a lot of cups and he's pouring one that's for her, but it's not designated for her.
It doesn't have her name on it.
Exactly. I mean, I have a cup from my bat mitzvah with my name on it and lots of little hearts. So like, that's my cup, but like.
Do you have it in your house now?
It's so funny that you say that, because I'm like, that's my cup. But then I'm like, you know what? It's actually at my parents' house.
Yeah, the one that says Yosef Abati is at my parents' house.
Maybe I should bring it to my house because I like that cup.
My kids, by the way, all have. It's a very Ashkenazi minhag.
Yeah.
My kids all have silver like kosod with their name on it.
Right. So that would be an issue to pour, the cup that has my name on it. But to pour a bunch of little cups, it's not an issue at all. So basically, one of these things hopefully should work for a couple. Yeah. And I'll just say, like, as an aside, another little thing that I sometimes find women raising about this, which I just want to make clear is not something that they should worry about too much, is that sometimes women, they're worried around Kiddush. This is not a halachic thing. This is just like a life thing. They're worried in their early months of pregnancy before they've announced or told anyone that they're expecting that they can't drink wine, and that if they don't drink, everyone's going to know that they're pregnant. And that same feeling of like violation that you described, just like people don't want to feel violated that people know that they're in nida. They don't want to feel violated that people know they're pregnant before they have to. And here, I also just, this is something that everyone could discuss with their own doctor. But from what I understand and in conversations with my doctors, to have a sip of wine is not something that you have to be concerned about. So if you're sitting at a table and they poured everybody wine and they didn't ask you if you want, and now you're like, oh, if I don't drink, everyone's going to be looking at me. I don't think that that's something that somebody has to feel too concerned about. And sometimes that does, come up in different situations. So that's in terms of that. I want to shift now to talk about one last topic that I think is very relevant to women.
Relevant,
yes, yep. to women around Kiddush, which is the question of what you can and cannot eat before you make Kiddush. So on Friday night, the Shabbat meal needs to begin with Kiddush, as we've said many times, and the Shulchan Aruch rules, therefore, that it's prohibited to taste anything, food or drink, even water, before we make Kiddush on Friday night from the time that we accept Shabbat, which for many women is often at candle lighting, or for other people, it might be when they daven or as Shabbat starts. But he says, in a case of great need, if you need to, still have a little bit of water, you could do that until Shkia, until halachik sunset, without first making Kiddush. I don't find that most people are struggling with this, because usually the time between when Shabbat begins and when the meal starts is usually an hour or two. And if you ate right before, usually that's not something that is so difficult. But again, this reminder that the meal is supposed to start with Kiddush, and part of the way that we sanctify Shabbat and show that it's different is that we don't just start eating. We have to begin with this official reciting of Kiddush, and that's why we don't eat before that.
So I think two things also, just if I think of practical real life scenarios that do come up, let's say on a Friday night. One is that it's a real process I've found to educate children to not eat.
Yes.
It's this question of so when do you say you can't, it's that's a sliding scale there of
there
what
you
kid is
feel it
capable
more.
of pulling back. The other thing I'll say, it's also a very specific scenario, but I just want to follow in your suit and see people out, listening, is that for people, let's say, who get very, very sick when they're pregnant, I know that I kind of had to throw many rules out the window at many different points in life, because I wasn't able to either not eat for long periods of time, and I just want to say that the struggle is real to retrain those muscles to hold yourself back a lot of times. It's true even just about mitzvah observance. If we were lenient with ourselves, you mentioned when we were talking about tefillah and all those episodes, you're lenient with yourself, and then you have to retrain yourself to get back to do that thing.
It's totally come up now with so many chayalim, with soldiers who have been in miluim, because they spent so many Shabbatot in battle where they weren't really able to keep a normal Shabbat, and then to get yourself back into that mindset. But it is important what you're saying, meaning anyone in a specific, unique circumstance, pregnant woman who's really not feeling well, somebody who's elderly, someone who's weak, somebody who's sick, someone who needs sick medication, of course they should ask about eating before Kiddush, even on Friday night.
Yeah, so just and put in that. Of course, the struggle is more real on Shabbat morning. So let's just talk a minute about Shabbat morning. Because there's sort of two factors here. One is because we follow the practical ruling of the Rambam that eating or drinking before Kiddush is also not allowed during the day, meaning it's a question. Because again, Kiddush is at a slightly lower level, so the question is, do we reapply all those halachot during the day? But we say that we do. We don't eat before Kiddush. But also the obligation to make Kiddush only really happens once somebody says shacharit. So we have this double-edged question, right? Of when does that come into play? In general, one really isn't supposed to eat or drink before you daven in the morning. So again, in theory, a person gets up, they daven shacharit, they make Kiddush, and then they can eat. But sometimes, for a whole host of reasons, and I would say especially for women, depending on their shul attendance and how their morning is going, that sometimes this could be a little bit less fluid and a little bit less clear about how that goes. But again, ideally, we don't eat before tefillah unless we have some very big need. Again, maybe you'll fill in some contours of that in a moment. And also, once we say shacharit, we have to hear Kiddush. So even, let's say, I'm just going to give a real life scenario from my home. My husband goes to the early minyan. He comes home at 8:30. He makes Kiddush, and then I go off to shul. Now, I have had something before I daven. In a minute, you'll explain why that's okay. And then when I come home, I can't eat until I make Kiddush, because I daven shacharit. So his Kiddush that I heard at 8:30 in the morning doesn't count anymore for me.
Right. So everything that you're saying is very, very, very important. First of all, everybody agrees that on Shabbat morning, if you want to drink water before you daven, that is totally fine.
Yeah.
You could always drink water before you daven, and you don't need to make Kiddush in order to drink water. If, though, you want to eat or drink anything more than water, then there's different opinions. So the Biur Halacha thinks that Kiddush should be recited by a woman who wants to eat anything before davening, even something small. But Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach holds differently than the Biur Halacha, and he thinks that if someone wants to eat or drink before they daven on Shabbat morning, they only need to make Kiddush if they're going to be eating an amount of food that's really significant. That's more like a real meal. And if it's food that's made out of grains, that they would need to say the bracha of mizonot for. So I don't know what you're eating in the morning, but like if somebody gets up and they, want to have a fruit, or they want to have a banana, or they want to have, something small, or they want to
A
have a
rice
cup of
cake.
coffee, or they want to have a rice cake or whatever, and they're not eating something that's similar to a meal. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach would say that they don't have to make Kiddush, and it's okay for them also, even if they haven't davened yet in that case. For married women, there's also another reason that someone may choose to permit eating before davening without making Kiddush, which is that Rav Moshe Feinstein argues that the obligation of Kiddush should come into effect at a uniform time for the entire household. So if a woman wants to eat, let's say early on Shabbat morning, but it's still early enough that her husband has not yet finished davening shacharit, it could be that since he is not yet obligated to make Kiddush because she still hasn't finished davening, then she's not yet either, and therefore she could eat before she davens without making Kiddush, okay? But one last thing to note is that there are often women who are busy with children at home, whether it's Shabbat or a regular weekday, who may not daven all of tefillah, or who might sometimes say Berkot HaShachar and then eat breakfast and get their kids out the door and then come back to the rest of Shacharit later. And on Shabbat, a woman in a situation like this, she should say or hear Kiddush after she finishes davening, whatever typical for her before she eats. So meaning, let's say, she only usually says a little bit of davening and then she eats, even though she hasn't finished all of Shacharit, she should still be making Kiddush at that point. And the easiest, most simple, straightforward thing to do is that she could literally just say the bracha of Borei Pri HaGafen. She doesn't need to say all the introductory, text that we say before of Zachor Yom HaShabbat or Visham or anything like that. Or if she's making it on liquor, she could just say a shahakol. If there's a reason why specifically a certain woman has difficulty at that hour of the day drinking wine or grape juice or liquor, anything like that, before she's had a real meal, then she could explore with a posek if there's another liquid that she can make Kiddush on, or she could discuss her entire situation and figure out what the best course of action would be. So there's a lot of little halachot here, but very relevant ones, I think, to our Shabbat experience. So we covered a lot, both in
Totally.
terms of ideas and in terms of some practical halachot. So given all of that, Yosefa, what's your takeaway for today?
I think I have a takeaway from this second part of the conversation, sort of on the halachot, and one from the first. I think on the halachic level, I really hope that we have really cleared the air for a lot of women, and just in letting them know that they're fully obligated and also can discharge the obligation of others. Like, I think that's a piece that is helpful and just clarifying in terms of like how this mitzvah functions. And I think the broader piece about thinking about the nature of what our Shabbat looks like, right? Of how we imbue it with something more than the refraining from something, how we bring our higher selves and create something that's special about Shabbat, I think is also something that I know I'm always thinking about, how to be realistic about that at different stages of life, and I hope that it moves people to think about that a little bit. What about you, Shayna?
I find myself thinking about the fact that there really are all these technical details, like even now talking about like all the aspects of when to make Kiddush, whatever, I like felt a little bit anxious of like, okay, we're putting this all out there. Someone's exercising, they're cooking, and they're going to be like, well, I'm expected to like remember all this. So I just want to say that even though there are all these technical details around Kiddush, and sometimes Kiddush could feel like something that we have to kind of just check off. I have to make Kiddush so that I could eat. I want to remind myself and all of us that there's really something much deeper and really beautiful going on here, which is our desire to really focus on that inherent Kedusha that Hashem imbued into Shabbat, as well as to think about the ways to sanctify Shabbat ourselves, and that Kiddush is this really beautiful opportunity to do that. And something actually that I always find meaningful in the daytime Kiddush is that there's that paragraph of the Shamru. Like if you don't just say Borei Pi HaGafen and you say some of those paragraphs before, there's a paragraph of the Shamru that sometimes in some homes people sing together. We don't do that, but now I'm like, I think I'm I'm going to, every episode
Every
I come out with
episode you come with something else.
Exactly. I went out to shul yesterday and my husband's like, really? You're going to shul? And I'm like, really? It's from that episode. So anyway, but when I'm in a home where they sing Vishamru, I really appreciate that opportunity to just like stop and think about the words that we're saying, because in that paragraph are these words, Beni ubein b'nei Israel oti le'olam. That Shabbat is an ode. It's a sign. It's a special sign that Hashem gave us, that He gave Bnei Israel, as a reminder that I created the world in 6 days and then I rested on the 7th day. And when we make Kiddush and we speak about this sign that Hashem gives us, it reminds us and it reinforces that very special connection that we have with Hashem. And therefore, how amazing and wonderful it is that women are also fully obligated in this mitzvah.
Thanks, Shana.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance. Make sure to check out the show notes for links on how this topic is discussed on Deracheha.org. Contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.